The rise of Empress Dowager Maria Theresa's favorite advisor began in the least likely of places. Born into the lower rungs of the minor nobility in the remote reaches of the Austrian countryside, he entered the imperial bureaucracy, not through patronage but merit, an anomaly in a system driven by lineage. His name, though later purged from many official registers, was Johann Franz von Hager. Initially assigned clerical duties in the War Council, Hager displayed a rare combination of administrative precision and unflinching loyalty. His memory for detailed command of 5 languages and firm grasp of military logistics quickly attracted the notice of senior officials. By 1755, amid the bureaucratic chaos of the ongoing War of the Austrian Succession, Hager caught the eye of Maria Theresa herself. In contrast to many of her other ministers, he showed neither flattery nor courtly charm, but instead a cold, calculated efficiency that the Empress Dowager came to rely on. She promoted him from his post to a direct advisory position, granting him daily access to her private cabinet. What began as a working relationship evolved into what some courtiers referred to, often in hushed tones, as a dangerous dependency. Maria Theresa, now a widow, had grown increasingly isolated at court. Her trust in men of noble blood had eroded over years of betrayal, half-hearted alliances, and court intrigue. Hager, with no aristocratic base and no military command of his own, posed no threat to the throne, yet held the Empress's ear more firmly than any duke or general. He was consulted on everything from fiscal policy to marriage alliances, and eventually began drafting letters in her name, a privilege reserved for only the highest ministers of state. But power, especially when held by someone of humble origins, seldom goes unnoticed. The Habsburg court was a nest of vipers, and Hager's rise invited speculation. His transformation from bureaucrat to confidant occurred too quickly for the comfort of the old aristocracy. Graf Kolderat, a high-ranking noble and longtime opponent of centralized power, reportedly referred to Hager as the serpent behind the throne. Others accused him more quietly of witchcraft or of involvement with secret societies, a common slander used to explain the inexplicable elevation of outsiders. His living quarters were also a point of interest. Unlike other courtiers who lived in opulent salons with portraits of ancestors and silver candlesticks, Hager occupied a stark suite of rooms lined with books, correspondence files, and strange anatomical sketches. He dined alone. Servants described him as polite but distant, refusing alcohol, and attending church services at odd hours. His only regular guest was a bohemian apothecary who brought tinctures and powders of unknown purpose. Still, his effectiveness was undeniable. He streamlined the tax system in Hungary, implemented anti-corruption audits in Galicia, and personally reviewed cases of judicial misconduct, exposing several noble families in the process. His enemies began to mount. One particularly obscure but chilling episode that underscored the growing resentment against him occurred in 1758. A ceremonial horse part of the imperial stables was found gutted in the courtyard outside Hager's apartments. Its entrails had been arranged into a grotesque pattern, a crude hexagram formed from intestines with severed hooves placed at each point. While no official inquiry was ever launched, servants were warned not to speak of the incident. Hager characteristically did not comment on it, but the silent message had been received he was being marked. Maria Theresa's protection held for a time. She dismissed talk of conspiracies and ordered any slander against Hager to be punished. Yet her support only intensified the suspicion that he wielded a kind of unspoken control over her. Foreign ambassadors took note. A Prussian diplomatic cable from 1761 describes Hager as a man whose voice carries weight beyond his rank, an invisible minister, and perhaps a necessary evil. The more power he gathered, the more invisible his trail became. He left no memoirs, kept no known personal diary, and rarely attended public events. There was no portrait commissioned in his lifetime. No commemorative statue, no marriage. But what exactly made his presence so intolerable to his rivals? Perhaps it was his immunity to bribery. Perhaps it was the relentless efficiency with which he destroyed the privileges of others. Or perhaps it was something more psychological, the way he hovered outside the norms of court behavior, bypassing the rituals that sustained aristocratic identity. To his enemies, Hager was not merely a threat to influence, he was a challenge to the very nature of the Habsburg order. And yet, with Maria Theresa's unwavering favor behind him, no one dared act, not yet. But they would wait. and when they struck it would be not with knives or duels, but with paper whispers and shadows. By the early 1760s, the Hofburg Palace, the epicenter of Habsburg imperial administration, had grown colder, quieter. Officials began avoiding the narrow corridor outside Maria Theresa's private study, where Johann Franz von Hager was frequently seen entering and exiting without so much as a glance toward others. His schedule was unnerving, arriving before sunrise, leaving after dusk, often carrying sealed bundles of correspondence, bound in black ribbon. Ministers once fluent in their proximity to power now found themselves submitting reports not directly to the Empress Dowager, but through Hager. This shift, subtle at first, soon became unmistakable. When appointments for provincial governors were announced, many bore the mark of Hager's preference. Financial decisions previously debated by council were now executed without consultation. And in a move that would draw fierce internal backlash, Hager initiated sweeping inquiries into military procurement fraud, uncovering, among other things, forged receipts and ghost soldiers on payrolls connected to noble families. Hager was no fool. He knew his presence at court was a rupture in the social fabric. In his own memos, he once described himself as a mechanism, not a gentleman. He cultivated no alliances, held no patronage network, and avoided formal ceremonies unless mandated. His utility to Maria Theresa was purely functional, and this very usefulness made him all the more intolerable to others. Among his staunchest detractors was Count Franz von Lacy, a decorated general and reform-minded aristocrat who viewed Hager's civilian oversight of military affairs as both unlawful and humiliating. Behind closed doors, Lacy and his ally, Prince Wenzel Kaunitz, the long-serving chancellor, began mapping out a slow campaign to discredit Hager without provoking the wrath of the Empress. To attack the favorite directly would be unwise, so instead they focused on sowing doubt. They began with subtleties, withholding crucial documents, questioning his methods in letters to foreign courts, and planting suggestive commentary in diplomatic reports. But their most effective tactic was psychological painting Hager not as a villain but as an instability. The idea was simple: if Hager could be portrayed as a source of unrest within the empire, then his removal would appear a restoration of order, not a coup. The setting for these moves was a court obsessed with optics. Rituals mattered. Every nod, every placement at the dining table, every exclusion from an invitation carried political weight. And Hager, who refused invitations altogether, had become an anomaly. At the Empress's annual spring procession, he was conspicuously absent. At the christening of the Archduchess Maria Carolina, he remained cloistered in his study, reviewing reports on Bohemian grain tariffs. This refusal to participate in ceremonial life fed rumors of arrogance or worse, subversion. A particularly disturbing episode occurred during a Lenten fast in 1764, when a senior cleric accused Hager of heresy in a confidential letter to the Archbishop of Vienna. The charge that he had mocked the sanctity of holy days and discouraged church attendance among officials. No evidence was provided, but the accusations circulated quietly among high clergy and nobles, planting the notion that Hager was not merely secular, but perhaps impious, even dangerous. At the same time, court gossip began to shift in tone. Servants whispered of locked drawers in Hager's quarters that no one was allowed to touch. A cook's assistant claimed to have seen diagrams not of lands but of bodies on Hager's desk, implying an unnatural interest in anatomy or worse. Though unverified, these stories found eager audiences in salons desperate for intrigue. Maria Theresa herself seemed increasingly conflicted. Her reliance on Hager was evident in her daily dealings, but letters from her daughter-in-law, Maria Josepha, reveal a growing discomfort. One letter from 1765 reads, "His presence is like a curtain drawn between Her Majesty and her own people. He inspires not loyalty, but silence." Others noted that Hager had begun refusing even the Empress's own requests for delays or exemptions, citing systemic consistency as his guiding principle. And then came his boldest initiative, one that may have sealed his fate. In 1766, he proposed the full reorganization of the provincial chancelleries. This plan, if enacted, would effectively dissolve many of the hereditary sinecures held by noble families, replacing them with salaried, merit-based appointments. It was revolutionary, it was efficient, and it was political suicide. The backlash was immediate. Count Lacy called the proposal an attack on noble honor. Kaunitz described it as a provocation against the empire's constitutional backbone. Even those who disliked corruption were uneasy at the prospect of losing their traditional roles. An anonymous note was found nailed to the door of Hager's residence. "Clockmaker of hell, your gears will jam in blood." No formal inquiry was launched, but Hager for the first time requested additional security detail. The guards assigned to him were not elite palace soldiers, but provincial men in insult disguised as precaution. What made this phase of Hager's life so psychologically intense was the slow erosion of certainty. He remained indispensable yet increasingly isolated. He could still issue directives, yet his messages began to be delayed or misfiled. Colleagues who once obeyed now responded with veiled delays. Invitations no longer came. His personal carriage was vandalized with pig's blood during a stormy night, and no one claimed responsibility. Despite all this, he refused to resign. In one memorandum scribbled hastily in the margin of a fiscal report, he wrote, "The machinery resists corruption, but the hands upon it rot with calculation." He had become the most powerful, powerless man in Vienna, and the machinery he had once set in motion was already being recalibrated for his removal. The conspiracy that would eventually destroy Johann Franz von Hager did not begin with a bang but with a whisper. By the early months of 1767, Hager's name had become radioactive in court circles. To praise him was to risk association with a collapsing faction. To speak against him was increasingly acceptable, even encouraged. The mechanisms of his downfall had been set into motion, not through formal decrees or noble edicts, but through the quiet coordination of those who had long waited for an opening. The epicenter of the conspiracy was not within the war councils or chancelleries, but in private salons, particularly that of Countess Amalie von Waldstein, an aging dowager whose connections stretched from the Viennese elite to the Jesuit order. She began convening clandestine gatherings in her residence, inviting select nobles, clerics, and military officers who had either been sidelined by Hager's reforms or who simply loathed the man's aloof efficiency. These meetings became breeding grounds for what would soon be referred to among insiders as the purge of the clockmaker. Among the most effective tools of their strategy was the mobilization of religious authority. The Jesuits, still deeply embedded in Austria's education and clerical administration, were drawn into the effort. Several key members, particularly Father Matthias Gratz, a well-connected confessor to multiple noble families, began collecting confessions and testimonials suggesting Hager's involvement in heretical beliefs. One document later discovered in the Jesuit archives chillingly describes Hager as one who dissects flesh, but denies the soul, a man without prayer, without fear, without communion. More dangerously, these confessions were framed not merely as moral grievances, but as evidence of political danger. Hager's isolation from the church was painted as evidence of allegiance to foreign ideologies, possibly Jansenism or even Enlightenment atheism, a threat to both throne and altar. Though Maria Theresa was herself a devout Catholic, she had long tolerated irreligiosity in her bureaucrats. But under enough pressure and the right circumstances, the tolerance could erode. The conspirators also turned to forgery. A collection of letters was crafted purporting to show Hager's contact with foreign agents. While their contents were vague references to mutual reform objectives and parallel bureaucratic structuring, they were written in Hager's exact handwriting, copied from real documents obtained by sympathetic clerks in the Imperial Archive. The forgeries were then found by a minor functionary during a document audit of the Foreign Office, an audit that had been scheduled unsurprisingly by one of Hager's opponents. Kaunitz, who had by now become the de facto orchestrator of the purge, ensured that the letters reached Maria Theresa in the most psychologically damaging way possible through an anonymous delivery left on her private desk, accompanied by a short note. It read, "He dismantles your empire piece by piece. He will do the same to your legacy." Maria Theresa, stunned and shaken, initially refused to believe it. But the seed had been planted. Her resolve began to waver. When she summoned Hager for a private audience, it was the first such meeting in weeks. Their conversation was not recorded, but according to a valet standing outside the chamber, voices were raised, something unheard of in their normally composed interactions. Following the meeting, Hager was seen leaving with visible agitation, his papers clutched so tightly that his knuckles were white. He returned to his chambers and did not emerge for 2 days. During this time, he wrote over 24 letters to various provincial offices. Some were intercepted, others vanished entirely. It is suspected that these were warnings or requests for protection. None of them were answered. A chilling psychological detail from this period comes from Hager's final diary entry scribbled in the margin of a report draft. The air no longer moves in straight lines. Doors close that were never opened. Meanwhile, Kaunitz and Lacey began preparing the final blow. With the Empress's cautious consent, not an order but a nod, they convened a secret committee of inquiry. Not a court, not a council, but a small group of loyal bureaucrats and legal scholars tasked with reviewing the administrative irregularities of Hager's tenure. The inquiry operated entirely in secret without informing Hager of its existence. Witnesses were selected carefully, many of them former subordinates whose careers had been stalled or punished under Hager's reforms. Testimonies were collected in silence, many under implied threats. Even more disturbing was the involvement of Franz Xaver Weindl, a former interrogator from the Habsburg censorship office who had once been dismissed for excessive cruelty. He was brought back unofficially to assist with clarity of record, a euphemism known at the time to mean psychological intimidation, and when needed, physical pressure. One clerk, a scribe named Matthias Planken, would later report in exile that testimony against Hager had been extracted from a trembling witness using a method called Seelenlicht soul light, where the accused was forced to stare into an open flame while being questioned repeatedly without food or rest for over 20 hours. The practice was not officially sanctioned, but neither was it unheard of in clandestine inquiries. The goal was not truth, but guilt. By spring of 1767, the dossier against Hager was complete alleged heresy contact with foreign agents' abuse of authority, and most damning of all, a plan to undermine the noble fabric of the empire. The language was vague but devastating, yet no arrest warrant was issued. Hager remained in place, still conducting imperial business, unaware that the ground beneath his feet had already disappeared. It would not be a public confrontation. It would be a quiet collapse engineered by those who understood that in Vienna death was not the only way to make a man vanish. The first indication that something had gone horribly wrong came not with a bang on the door but with a silence. On the morning of April 9, 1767, Johann Franz von Hager arrived at his chambers in the Hofburg, as he had every day for over a decade. But this time, the documents he expected, daily correspondence reports from the Bohemian Chancery military inventories, were missing. His inkwell had not been filled. The hallway outside was unusually quiet. The two clerks assigned to assist him had not appeared. Later that day, his security escort was quietly replaced, not with the usual provincial guards he had requested months prior, but with men from the Hofkriegsrat, the War Council, operating under an old commission that had not been used in years. These soldiers wore no insignia. They did not speak to him. They simply stood outside his door. Still, no charges were announced. It was only that evening when Hager attempted to leave the Hofburg to attend a scheduled audit in the Hungarian accounts office that he was stopped by a plainclothes agent and informed that he was under administrative isolation. No arrest, no formal charge, but effective confinement all the same. Behind the scenes, the Empress Dowager Maria Theresa had finally been persuaded or pressured into silence. Though she had not ordered Hager's imprisonment, she had also refused to intervene. According to one surviving note from her personal secretary, she merely said, "Let the instruments of justice act." That statement, vague and chilling, would haunt her in the years that followed. With the Empress's non-resistance secured, Hager's enemies acted swiftly. They released to the inner court a carefully curated cache of letters, a mix of real and forged documents, suggesting that Hager had entered into clandestine correspondence with agents of the French court, and more scandalously with Turkish intermediaries along the southern frontier. The letters, laden with bureaucratic euphemisms, never explicitly mentioned treason, but in the political context of 18th century Austria, the implication was clear. Hager was working to destabilize the empire's noble-led hierarchy in coordination with foreign powers. The Empress, while never shown the original copies, was told that the evidence was too shameful to her office to be made public. Her advisors emphasized discretion. To expose Hager would be to expose her own complicity in elevating and defending him. The best option, they argued, was quiet resolution. Thus began the covert tribunal. Unlike formal imperial trials which were documented and subject to public record, this tribunal operated in secret under the pretext of national security. Its members were appointed not for their impartiality but for their obedience. 2 military judges, a former censor and a noble canonist from Salzburg, comprised the panel. Hager was not permitted to appear before them. Instead, they reviewed a set of charges compiled by Kaunitz's faction charges, supported by testimonies gathered under coercion and in at least one case physical torture. The most disturbing element of the process was the reappearance of a man thought permanently dismissed from imperial service, Jakob Linde, known as the Listener. Once employed in the censorship office, Linde had developed a reputation for psychological games, a man who could extract confessions without ever lifting a hand. He had been quietly brought into the tribunal's inner circle. According to a later memoir by a court scribe, Linde's role was not merely to evaluate Hager's guilt, but to interpret the implications of his silence. When Hager refused to respond to several inquiries submitted in writing, Linde concluded that his silence could only signify acknowledgement. It was a grotesque inversion of due process. Silence was guilt and denial was defiance. Meanwhile, rumors about the contents of Hager's supposed letters spread through the court like wildfire. Some claimed they referenced a plan to reorganize the military command structure to bypass aristocratic generals. Others whispered that Hager intended to introduce a rationalist council composed entirely of non-nobles, a bureaucratic revolution that would have destroyed the hereditary privileges of the court. Whether any of these claims were true was irrelevant. They served their purpose to frame Hager as not only a political radical, but an existential threat to the foundations of the Habsburg monarchy. A particularly grotesque twist came when the tribunal uncovered what it described as ritualistic materials in Hager's apartments: anatomical sketches, jars of preserved organs, likely remnants of his studies into battlefield medicine, and a set of diagrams comparing the nervous systems of animals. These were taken as evidence of heretical practice. One monk brought in to examine the items declared them to be unnatural meditations upon the body absent the soul. It was enough. The tribunal did not issue a formal verdict. Instead, it submitted a sealed recommendation to the Empress immediate dismissal, full confiscation of property and permanent removal from civil affairs. The phrase permanent removal was understood by all involved to mean death, but not public execution, which could spark questions or sympathy, rather a silent disposal, an erasure. On May 3, 1767, Maria Theresa signed a brief memo likely drafted by Kaunitz, authorizing the tribunal's recommendation in the interest of internal unity and future discipline. That memo bore no name, no charge, no reference to Hager's service. That night, Hager was taken from his residence under the pretense of transfer to a different administrative post. He did not resist. His final words, recorded only by the carriage driver who transported him, were, "I have served the empire more faithfully than it deserved. Let that be my crime." He was never seen in court again. His apartments were sealed the next morning. The doors bore no markings. His name was not spoken at the next council. His chair at the Treasury Board was left vacant, then quietly reassigned. He had vanished not in blood but in paperwork. By the morning of May 4, 1767, Johann Franz von Hager no longer existed in any official sense. His name had been struck from meeting rosters, his papers confiscated, and his staff reassigned. To the court record keepers, he was now listed as relieved of duties, cause discretionary. In the bureaucratic language of the Habsburg, this was tantamount to a living burial. But while the public remained unaware, the machinery of Hager's final punishment had already begun behind the stone walls of the imperial prison beneath the Minoritenplatz. Located not far from the Jesuitenkirche, the prison was known internally as the Silberkeller, the silver cellar, due to its underground vaults that had once stored imperial silver. Now repurposed as a covert detention site for sensitive political cases, the Silberkeller was a place from which men emerged altered, if at all. Hager was held in total isolation. No trial was announced. No official interrogation recorded. The guards assigned to him were selected not for their loyalty to the state, but for their silence. They were drawn from the Geheime Polizeiwache, the secret security detachment that answered directly to the inner councilmen, trained in discretion, obedience, and the psychological softening of prisoners. On his second day in confinement, Hager was subjected to what his jailers called Stufenbeichte, or the stair confession, an archaic Habsburg practice, abandoned decades earlier, but revived under Kaunitz's guidance. In this method, the accused was blindfolded and brought down progressively deeper levels of the prison, each descent accompanied by a recitation of charges real or imagined. With each level, the air grew thinner, the light dimmer, and the accusations more damning. It was less a technique of interrogation than a psychological breaking point meant to disorient and fragment. According to a smuggled account later penned by a junior scribe, Hager never confessed. Even as he was led into the deepest vault, a chamber with no light and no airflow known among guards as der Schweigeraum, the silence room, he maintained his innocence. He refused food for 2 days. He would speak only in Latin, reciting fragments of legal code and classical poetry. Then came the sentence. Issued orally, never written down, it was delivered by a hooded member of the tribunal's enforcement body. Hager was to be executed not by sword gallows or axe, all of which would grant him the status of a criminal or traitor, but by corda lenta, a method once reserved for heretics and disgraced servants. The technique was medieval in origin, a slow strangulation with a twisted cord looped around the neck, tightened gradually over a period of minutes to induce asphyxiation, panic, and finally paralysis. The death could take as long as 20 minutes. Worse still, the execution would be conducted in the Kammerloch, an unused cistern chamber repurposed for unrecorded deaths. It had no windows, no drain, and no acoustics. A place designed not only to end life, but to erase its echo. Only 3 men were present for the execution: the cordmaster, a Jesuit observer, and a physician whose role was not to save but to confirm. No priest administered last rites. One of the few surviving oral testimonies from that night came from a gravedigger assigned to dispose of the body afterward. According to his whispered recollection, Hager's hands had been bound behind his back with red waxed cord, the same kind used for sealing state documents. His head had been shaven, perhaps in symbolic reduction. The strangulation took 13 minutes. At its end, his jaw had locked open in what the physician noted as residual resistance. But perhaps the most grotesque element of the punishment was what followed. In accordance with an old Habsburg ritual used to condemn political heretics, all of Hager's personal effects, clothing letters, journals, and even his inkstand were burned in a sealed room beneath the Hofburg. The fire was scented with myrrh and dried lavender, the traditional materials used in cleansing rituals. Officials tasked with the burning wore gloves and masks. No ash was preserved. The ritual was meant to simulate not justice, but purification, the erasure of contagion. Even more disturbingly, Hager's nameplate from his office door was broken in half and placed into a lead box filled with salt, which was then buried beneath the floor of the imperial archives. This strange symbolic burial mixing salt, lead, and inscription echoes certain medieval rituals designed to trap a soul in silence. No formal announcement of his death was ever issued. Maria Theresa did not speak of him again in public. In private correspondence, she referred only once to a man whose loyalty outpaced his discretion, a phrase so ambiguous it could apply to anyone. Yet his erasure could not stop the whispers. Word spread quietly among foreign embassies. The Prussian envoy wrote in code, "The empire has silenced its cleverest mechanism." One wonders who winds the clock now. The Ottoman ambassador, upon learning of Hager's fate, reportedly remarked, "Vienna devours its own architects." Among the Viennese lower courts, a myth began to circulate that Hager had not died, but had been mechanically unmade, transformed into a voiceless servant, condemned to roam the catacombs beneath the palace. Children were warned that the clockmaker waits beneath the city stones. Whatever the truth, his influence was gone. The reforms he had championed were quickly dismantled or diluted. Provincial governors were reappointed along hereditary lines. The idea of meritocratic promotion in the civil service was quietly shelved. The Hofburg returned to its old rhythms, its familiar rituals. But the silence that followed was louder than any decree. In the aftermath of Johann Franz von Hager's disappearance, the Hofburg settled into a strange equilibrium. The very structure he had helped stabilize through precision and ruthless logic was now being dismantled by those who had once feared its efficacy. Kaunitz and his allies moved quickly to reoccupy the vacant administrative space. Committees were restructured, reporting lines rerouted, and several of Hager's fiscal reforms, including centralized auditing and the merit-based promotion system, were quietly repealed under the guise of pragmatic realignment. But the scars remained. Inside the imperial chancelleries, fear replaced discipline. Officials who had once championed Hager's policies now denied ever supporting him. Archives were combed for signatures linking prominent names to his administration. Many were mysteriously redacted or refiled under new titles. In some instances, entire ledgers were burned to prevent association with what was now called euphemistically the rationalist incident. At the center of this revisionism stood Maria Theresa, whose silence had become a source of both curiosity and dread. She never publicly acknowledged the death of her former favorite, and yet her routines shifted in ways that betrayed the weight of guilt. She began rising later in the day, ceased visiting the gardens where she once walked with Hager, to discuss policy and forbade the playing of certain sonatas that had been favored during his tenure. Diplomatic correspondence reflects subtle but telling signs of distress. In one letter to her daughter in Naples, she confessed, "I have learned that silence is not peace. One may silence a bell, but still it rings within." Her once sharp attention to detail began to fade. Reports were returned unread. Edicts were signed without careful review. One of her closest chamberlains, Count Ludwig von Styrum, would later write in his private diary, "Her Majesty wanders between duty and reverie. She speaks less of state and more of past hours. The throne still stands, but no longer glows." Meanwhile, efforts to erase Hager's memory from official history grew increasingly meticulous. His portrait, one of the few painted in secret by an Italian court artist, was removed from a locked gallery and believed to have been destroyed. His family, distant and minor, were relocated to Moravia under a fabricated accusation of financial misconduct. They vanished from the Vienna census within the year. And yet the very act of erasure gave rise to legend. Among junior clerks and archivists, whispered tales began to circulate of a black book, a leather-bound volume kept under Hager's personal seal, containing secret reforms and warnings for future crises. Whether this book existed or not was irrelevant. Its mythology became a symbol of the buried truth. In some versions of the story, the book was hidden behind a false wall in the imperial library. In others, it had been smuggled to Venice by a sympathetic diplomat. None were confirmed. All were believed. One particularly haunting rumor held that Hager had left behind a final memorandum entitled Mechanisms of Dignity, in which he outlined the structural weaknesses of the empire and predicted its eventual unraveling should merit be replaced once again with birthright. No such document was ever recovered, though reports from Prussian intelligence suggest something of the sort may have reached Berlin, where Frederick the Great reportedly remarked Austria buried its own compass. Psychologically, the trauma of the episode left deep marks. Several mid-level administrators who had been closest to Hager suffered nervous breakdowns within months of his disappearance. One, Karl Wirtz, reportedly began compulsively reciting tax codes aloud in empty rooms before being committed to an asylum. Another, a former translator named Paul Nadasti, jumped into the Danube after claiming the empire had lost its mind. And yet life at court carried on. The halls of the Hofburg echoed with the usual pageantry, masquerade balls, betrothal announcements, royal baptisms. But for those who looked closer, something was different. During a state dinner in early 1768, a French envoy noted in his diary, "The Austrians dance, but their rhythm is cautious. There is joy on their faces, but the eyes are looking elsewhere, downward, inward, backward." The empire had regained its old hierarchy, but lost something intangible, the belief that excellence could prevail over bloodline. Hager had embodied that dangerous hope, and his destruction reaffirmed the hierarchy's survival at a cost few dared to admit. One of the darkest and most symbolic developments came in late 1768, when the Empress ordered the sealing of an underground annex of the Hofburg, once used for civil records, the very chamber where Hager had conducted his late-night reviews and policy drafts. The order cited structural instability, though no inspections were conducted. The annex was walled off the entrance, barred with an iron grill. No one questioned it. And yet for years afterward, guards would occasionally report hearing faint sounds from behind the sealed wall. The scratch of a pen, the rustle of papers, the soft clink of a clock resetting its gears. Most dismissed it as superstition. But for others, it was the empire's conscience trying and failing to remember. The execution of Johann Franz von Hager did not mark a clean end, but rather the beginning of a haunting ripple that radiated through the imperial system for years. As Austria lurched forward into an increasingly complex political landscape, strained by fiscal shortfalls, military stagnation, and a looming crisis of succession, the ghost of the vanished bureaucrat became more than a memory. It became a symbol and accusation etched into the machinery of the state. Although officially erased, Hager's influence continued to surface in the most inconvenient places. A set of tax reform proposals submitted by a provincial official in Moravia bore clear resemblance to Hager's suppressed 1766 memorandum on estate assessments. When questioned, the official claimed to have rediscovered the idea independently, though his phrasing mirrored language that had once appeared in Hager's circulars, right down to the term modular revenue tiering. The proposal was rejected without explanation. In Galicia, a customs enforcement system resembling one of Hager's trial models based on rotating inspection routes rather than fixed checkpoints was quietly reintroduced in 1769. No credit was assigned, but those who remembered Hager's handwriting could see it in the margins even if no one dared speak his name aloud. Meanwhile, in academic circles across Vienna and Prague, a new term began to circulate among younger scholars of administration and philosophy mechanocrat. While never formally defined, the word came to denote an official who valued system over status function, over form a thinly veiled reference to Hager's legacy. Older professors dismissed it as idealistic jargon. But in whispered debates, students of law and governance debated whether such figures could exist in the empire without meeting the same fate. Not all were content to let Hager's name remain buried. In 1770, a small pamphlet appeared in Vienna under the title Über das Schweigen der Werkzeuge, on the silence of instruments. Printed anonymously, its author claimed to have witnessed Hager's execution and described the episode in allegorical terms: a kingdom where the king's clockmaker is accused by the court of causing storms because the bell tolls too clearly. The pamphlet was banned within a week, and possession of it was declared a punishable offense. Yet copies continued to circulate in underground intellectual circles, and fragments were reprinted abroad, particularly in Prussia. One obscure and chilling side effect of the entire episode was psychological, a form of collective repression that manifested in administrative culture. Clerks became hyper-attuned to hierarchy. Ministers who had once experimented with reform grew visibly cautious. Files referencing Hager were not just discarded but ritually destroyed, often with fire or ink soaking. A culture of preventive loyalty took root. Officials avoided any proposal that might be interpreted as systematizing too much, centralizing too quickly, or eliminating too many noble privileges. This repression came to a grotesque head in 1771 when a junior bureaucrat named Marcus Eberl was dismissed and arrested for authoring a treatise on rationalizing grain tariffs. Though his work made no mention of Hager, it was deemed resonant with disruptive precedents. Eberl was interrogated for weeks before being released, shattered and silent. He never published again, but the legacy of Hager could not be fully suppressed. It lingered not only in reforms, but in the architecture of memory. Several minor officials, unable to speak openly, began embedding veiled references to him in the preambles of their reports. Phrases like "in service of the invisible mechanic" or "in honor of unspoken precision" appeared sporadically, linguistic ghosts haunting the empire's paperwork. In the international sphere, foreign observers took a darker view. French intelligence reports described Austria's internal politics as a court where brilliance is devoured and mediocrity thrives. The British ambassador wrote of a new Habsburg caution, born of a fear to repeat the error of letting minds rise faster than titles. And from Berlin, Frederick the Great, ever the enemy of Habsburg stagnation, reportedly made an offhand remark that would echo for years. Austria teaches its servants to obey, not to think. When one begins to think, one begins to vanish. Even more unnerving were the ritualistic elements that clung to the story, like cobwebs, relics of the empire's subconscious guilt. The walled-off room where Hager had once worked remained sealed, its existence officially denied. Yet guards stationed nearby insisted that wax seals appeared on its door at irregular intervals, as if someone inside still sent out warnings. One officer claimed to have found a folded note one morning, tucked into a doorframe bearing only the phrase "they build again" with broken tools. Of course, these were likely fabrications, but they served a purpose. The myth of Hager became a mechanism for understanding the empire's contradictions, its thirst for reform, and its reflex to crush the reformer. He had become, in effect, a cautionary tale recited not by storytellers, but by archivists, clerks, and secretaries who feared becoming too effective. And then in 1772, a final insult, or perhaps a gesture of restoration. The Habsburg state quietly reinstituted a modified version of Hager's provincial rotation system under a new name, the Circular Model of Fiscal Administration. Its author, a nobleman with no background in finance but impeccable lineage. The system, while stripped of Hager's more radical elements, was heralded as a triumph of innovation. Not once was Johann Franz von Hager mentioned. The final phase of Johann Franz von Hager's erasure was paradoxically also the most visible. Though his name had been struck from every ledger his body long since disposed of, and his memory officially forbidden, he remained embedded not in marble or ink, but in the habits, fears, and superstitions of a court that could not cleanse itself of its own hypocrisy. Maria Theresa, though never openly remorseful, displayed subtle and accumulating signs of grief. In 1773, after years of mental and physical decline, she ordered a full reorganization of her privy council. Several key ministers, including Count Kaunitz, were quietly sidelined under the guise of health and retreat. At first, this was interpreted as merely another fluctuation in court politics. But those closest to her noted a pattern in her appointments. New officials were chosen for their discretion, their diligence, and most tellingly, their lack of noble title. One of them, a Bohemian jurist named Leonhard Kratzer, bore an uncanny resemblance in temperament to Hager. Reserved, precise, indifferent to flattery. When asked to describe his role in the imperial service, he allegedly replied, "I am only a function." The irony was not lost on those who remembered. The Empress's change in personnel was accompanied by increasingly erratic behavior. She would cancel meetings without notice. She refused to ride in the eastern wing of the Hofburg, the section closest to Hager's former chambers. Most revealingly, she began keeping a locked box on her writing desk, the contents of which were known only to her confessor. According to rumor, it contained either Hager's final report, somehow preserved, or a collection of his personal effects returned in secret after his death. If true, it would be the only surviving trace of his existence. Psychologically, Maria Theresa's deterioration took the form of ritual. She began referring to one of her daily hours of prayer as the quiet hour during which she reportedly read from an unnamed document and wept. Her attendants were ordered to leave her undisturbed. Some claimed she spoke aloud during these sessions not to God, but to the architect. Whether she meant Hager is unknowable, but the phrase became common shorthand among her household staff. In 1775, she commissioned a painting anonymous and unsigned depicting a faceless man standing in the shadows of a vast archive. The man holds a broken hourglass. Behind him, scrolls unravel across the floor. No one ever claimed authorship of the piece. It was hung in a private study and later removed by her successor. As the years passed, the court tried to move on. New wars began, new threats emerged. But within the imperial bureaucracy, a strange duality persisted, a continued reliance on structure and order, paired with a deep fear of those who mastered it too completely. Be competent, but not too competent, became an unspoken rule for mid-level officials. Loyalty is safe. Innovation is risk. The lesson of Hager had been absorbed. Even in death, he had reshaped the system. In one last, deeply symbolic gesture, Maria Theresa made a posthumous change to the empire's administrative protocol. A new rank was created, Subsecretarius Extra Ordinem, meant to designate civil officials with undefined duties. It was a role that reported directly to the crown, with limited visibility and no succession. Ostensibly a reward for discretion, it was in fact a mirror of Hager's ghostly final years. The first appointment to the position bore no family crest, no ceremony, no public record. It was a role designed for someone like him, or perhaps in memory of him. When Maria Theresa died in 1780, her funeral was marked by full imperial honors. But within the procession, a peculiar absence was noted by at least one attendee. No official representing the financial ministry walked among the mourners. Their place was left blank or forgotten. And in the sealed archives beneath the Hofburg, a small inscription was discovered decades later, carved into the stone behind a cabinet. Let it be recorded, the mind that served was severed, but not unmade. Whether the carving was real or apocryphal hardly mattered. The sentiment remained. By the time the Habsburg Empire entered its slow 19th century decline, the story of Johann Franz von Hager had become a kind of institutional legend, an internal parable about the cost of clarity. Some told it as a warning, others as a quiet tribute. a few perhaps even as a prayer. The story of Johann Franz von Hager, the invisible minister, the erased mechanic of empire, is not one found in textbooks. It survives in silence in the absence of names, where names should be in systems whose origins are obscured, and in the nervous caution of bureaucrats who rise too swiftly. His life and execution form a cautionary tale about the tension between intelligence and obedience, between reform and ritual, between function and fear. Maria Theresa's reign is often remembered for its strength, its reforms, and its resistance to external threats. But beneath that narrative lies the unspoken cost of sustaining an empire that could not tolerate brilliance outside its bloodline. Hager was not destroyed for treason in the conventional sense. He was destroyed because he threatened the fiction that the nobility alone could be trusted with the levers of power. His merit was not denied, it was too visible to be denied, and that visibility made him dangerous. In psychological terms, Hager's erasure reflects a deep pathology within authoritarian systems, the inability to reconcile the need for reform with the fear of destabilization. His execution was not the punishment of a crime, but the removal of a contradiction. He was both indispensable and intolerable a man who proved that the state could run more efficiently without its aristocrats, and thus had to be silenced to preserve the illusion of noble necessity. Yet Hager's ghost, metaphorical or otherwise, continues to haunt the architecture of institutions built on hierarchy over competence. He represents the uncomfortable truth that systems often sacrifice their best servants to protect their worst habits. And though his body was destroyed, his methods persisted, quietly resurrected under different names cloaked in safer identities. He was forgotten by design but remembered by consequence.